Hi everyone. So let's go ahead and take a look at section 5 of chapter 23. So now we're going to get into the specifics on respiration. So we'll kind of do an overview of the process of respiration, the 4 continuous processes that are going to occur, and then we're going to focus on the very first part, which is pulmonary ventilation. As you can see, there's a lot to cover in this section, so it's going to be broken up into a couple of different videos. So just a reminder on what respiration was, and we covered this at the very beginning of this chapter about how it's that general process of exchanging respiratory gases between the atmosphere and the systemic cells of the body. So it's going to do this through 4 continuous and simultaneous processes. It's going to do this through pulmonary ventilation, alveolar gas exchange, gas transport, and systemic gas exchange. So let's go ahead and take a look at this little chart right here. So this is going in and looking at pulmonary ventilation. That's our very first step, is taking in air. So let's follow the air and see what happens to oxygen and then to carbon dioxide. We're going to kind of bring it back that way. So in the atmosphere, when we breathe in, we're going to breathe in oxygen. And then we need to get that oxygen from the alveoli into the capillaries. And that's what happens with alveolar gas exchange. Some books will call this external respiration. In this book, I guess it's a better term because you can remember it a little bit better, but alveolar gas exchange. So once we get that oxygen into the blood, it's going to be transported around so we can get it to those systemic cells. And that's when we have the other type of gas exchange, which is the systemic gas exchange. And that's when the oxygen is going to move from the blood and go over to those systemic cells so they can use it for cellular respiration. Some books will call this one internal respiration. But again, this book calls it systemic gas exchange, which is a better term, an easier term to remember. So let's see what happens on the other way, because at the same time that we're dropping off oxygen to these systemic cells so they can use it for cell respiration, those cells are going to produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct of cell respiration. So that needs to move from the cells into the blood. Again, systemic gas exchange. And then it's going to move through the blood because we need to get it up here to the alveoli. We need to get it from the blood into the alveoli in our alveolar gas exchange. And then once we get it there, we can exhale that out into the atmosphere. So that's this is going to be a table that goes through just talking about it in words, I guess putting it in word form. But I like this because it goes through the important body systems of each that are going to be involved for each of those. So for pulmonary ventilation, we're going to have the respiratory system. We're going to have the skeletal system. We're going to have the muscular system, the nervous system. But then with alveolar gas exchange, we have respiratory and cardiovascular because it's going to be the alveoli and the blood, the capillaries. Gas exchange is all about, gas transport. It's all about cardiovascular system as well as systemic gas exchange. We're still going to go through these and talk about them because it is part of that whole general respiratory process. All right, so like I said, we are going to start, this section is going to cover the very first part, which is going to be pulmonary ventilation, which is also known as breathing. This is going to be that movement of air into and out of the lungs. Inspiration is when we bring air into the lungs. Another term is inhalation. And expiration is going to force air out of the lungs, and that's going to be exhalation as well. So that's another term. So either one that you can use. But it's going to be this kind of cyclic process that our body is going to undergo to carry out pulmonary ventilation. And remember, when we are inhaling, we are getting that oxygen in. And when we exhale, we are trying to get rid of the carbon dioxide. There's basically 2 types of breathing. You're going to have something called quiet breathing. Another term for quiet breathing is eupnea. Anytime you see this root word, it has to do with the type of breathing that's going on. So popping that EU in front of it makes it quiet breathing. This is the normal rhythmic breathing that's occurring when you are at rest, when you're hanging out and watching a show on the couch or anything like that, anything at rest. Average rate is 12 to 15 times per minute with that respiratory cycle. But of course, we do undergo forced breathing. So another term for forced breathing is hyperpnea. Hyperpnea. It's kind of an interesting term right there, right? This is going to be any kind of vigorous breathing that occurs. This can accompany exercise. It accompanies any kind of hard exertion. It accompanies anytime that you are actively manipulating or active manipulation. And what am I mean? Sorry about that. I'm getting caught up in my words. What I mean by that is, say that you're trying to breathe as you sing and things. And so it's going to be something similar to that. That's what I mean by active manipulation. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at is that whole process of inhalation and exhalation. So pulmonary ventilation is going to have a very general process. It's going to involve the nervous system. You're always going to start with the nervous system whenever you want to inhale or exhale. And it's mainly going to set off the whole inhalation, and we'll take a look at that later on. But what they do, what the nervous system is going to do is stimulate the skeletal muscles that are going to be involved in breathing. And what happens is those muscles are going to cyclically contract and relax. When they contract and relax, you're going to have changes that are going to occur in your thoracic cavity, volume changes. And when you have volume changes, that changes the pressure in the thoracic cavity as well. And that is going to result in a pressure gradient. That's going to be the driving force on what's going to cause us to either inhale or exhale, that pressure gradient. So this section is going to kind of go through and concentrate on three main processes here. It's going to, not processes, but three main sections. It's going to cover the neural component. It's going to cover the actual mechanics of breathing. This is the whole mechanics of breathing. We're going to take a look and see what happens. And then it also covers pulmonary measurements, these volumes and capacities. We're not going to go into that a whole lot. You're going to be doing a lab over it, a lab simulation. So that's why we're not going to get into it a lot in lecture, because you're going to do the lab. So we're first going to start on this. We're going to look at the mechanics of breathing. We're going to talk about what happens, how muscles, or not how, but which muscles are contracting and relaxing and how that changes the volume and pressure and all that good stuff. Once we finish that, the next video that you're going to watch, we're going to break this up into two because it would be extremely long. The next video we're going to watch after that is going to focus on this point right here. Focus on how the nervous system is going to control the skeletal muscles, what causes the whole stimulus to breathe, and things like that. And then the last one I'll cover in the same video with the nervous system is going to be those a brief overview of those pulmonary measurements. All right, so let's go ahead and get into this, the mechanics of breathing. So there's several things that are going to occur. So lots of things that we have to talk about before we even get into the mechanics of breathing on how we breathe. We're going to take a look at the specific actions of skeletal muscles. We are going to look at the changes that occur in the thoracic cavity, and we're going to take a look at this whole relationship between volume and pressure. And then we're going to take a look at pressure gradients, and we're going to take a look at volumes and pressures. So this book does a lot of kind of setting up, getting you ready before we talk about things. So this is the kind of getting ready part, preparing you to talk about the whole process of inhalation and exhalation. So we're going to start with skeletal muscles. Let's go ahead and start with that first. All right, there's going to be three categories of skeletal muscles. You're going to have the ones that are going to be involved in quiet breathing, that eupnea. these are going to go in and increase the dimensions of the thoracic cavity. And most of it is going to come from that diaphragm. You can kind of see it right here. You guys remember the diaphragm is going to be that muscle that separates the thoracic from the abdominal pelvic cavity. So, but that's where it is right there. But remember, of course, it goes all the way across. It's just that these muscles are covering it up. But also another big factor that's going to help go in and that are going to go in and contract and cause these volume changes are going to be the external intercostals. Remember, those are found in between the ribs. You have internal and external. These are the externals. Externals are responsible for quiet breathings, mainly that quiet inhalation that we'll take a look at, but quiet breathing. You can see them here, but then you can also see them a lot more on the back as well in between each of those ribs. The next set that we're going to be taking a look at, both of these are going to be involved in that forced breathing. So what happens whenever your yoga teacher tells you to take a deep breath, deepest breath possible in, and then the deepest possible exhalation out. That's going to be some good forced breathing right there. So some of the key muscles in forced inspiration, their main job is to go in and pull upward and outward. Look at what they're doing. They're going in and either lifting because if you think about your sternocleidomastoid right here, it's going to, look where it's attached. It's going to go in and lift the rib cage. Everything else, look, scalenes, pectoralis minor, serratus, specifically the serratus posterior, because the ones that you might remember from 2401 were the serratus anterior, the ones in the front. These are ones in the back, so you might not have identified those, which is fine. And also the erector spinae are going to be key muscle groups in there as well to help with this forced inspiration. But look, elevate ribs, elevate ribs, elevate ribs. So that's the good thing with these. Let's take a look at these. Look, remember those scalenes right here? Look, there are those serratus posterior superior. And there's the little pectoralis minors right there. So they're all, as you can see, attached to some rib. And when they contract, they're going to pull it up, upwards and outwards. All right. Let's take a look at the forced expiration. So these are going to do the opposite of the muscles of forced inspiration. They're going to pull down and inwards. Lots and lots of abs here. See? The transversus abdominis, external oblique. Two big ab muscles right there. But you also have your internal intercostals. So these are the ones that are going to be kind of closer to the sternum right there. Some different serratus posteriors. These are the ones at the bottom, the inferior ones. I know that you guys probably didn't learn the transversus thoracis, so you don't have to worry about those. But let's take a look and see what happens. The abdominal muscles that we looked at, it's mainly going in compressing the abdominal components. And we're going to talk about how that forces the diaphragm in a different position. And that's going to help change the volume. Again, all of these muscles, what they're doing is changing the volume of the thoracic cavity, which is what we definitely need here. Look, depresses rib down here. So that's what's going to happen. So let's go ahead and take a look at the dimensional changes that are going to occur within the thoracic cavity. Those dimensional changes are going to come from the muscles that we just looked at. Now the book will go through and specifically talk about, hey, these muscles are going to change it anterior, posteriorly, and laterally. And these muscles are going to go in and change it vertically. You do not have to memorize which muscles are changing it in which dimension. As long as you understand what muscles are involved with what type of breathing. So that's going to be the key. Let's go ahead and look at how the thoracic cavity changes. Look, so one is going to be a vertical change, and that's mainly from the diaphragm. If you had to know any muscle and which one it goes to, would be the diaphragm and how it is going to be the key one that changes it vertically here. So look, it's usually going to be in relaxed position. It's domed. It's in this domed position right here. And look how short it is vertically. Yeah, but during contraction, it actually pushes down and it is going to open up vertically quite a bit. Let's take a look at lateral changes. The ribs, when the ribs are elevated, then that's going to cause the thoracic cavity to widen. And look what happens whenever the ribs are depressed. That's going to narrow the thoracic cavity. And then you have anterior posterior changes. You're looking at what's happening between that the vertebra and the sternum. So the inferior portion of the sternum moves anteriorly, and that's going to expand that thoracic cavity. And then look at what happens with compression. So that's when the sternum is going to move posteriorly, and that's going to the thoracic cavity is going to be compressed. So you can kind of see what happens. Look, in inspiration, what's going to happen is we are going to go in and open up and increase the volume, right? That's what we're doing in inspiration. In expiration, look at everything that happens. We are going in and decreasing the volume in here. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. Yeah, so I keep talking about this whole kind of volume change that occurs. Let's talk about why we need a volume change in the first place. And that is going to have to do with Boyle's law. So if you've taken chemistry, then you know and love Boyle's law, right? This has to do with the relationship to volume and pressure. Remember, I talked about one of the key things, the driving forces between inhalation and exhalation is this pressure gradient. I haven't even gotten to pressure yet. We've been talking about muscles that are changing the thoracic cavity, and that's changing the volume. So this is how it relates to pressure. So at a constant temperature, the pressure, that should be of a gas, decreases if the volume of the container increases, and vice versa. So do you see how they have this nice inverse relationship? So let's take a look. Here's a nice little cylinder that's going to have all of these little gases in it. It's a big volume, so there's not a whole lot of pressure, but let's take a look and see what happens when we go in and decrease the volume. So really, pressure is about a force. So what happens to these gases is they are going to start to bump into one another. They bump on the wall, they bump into another one, and anytime that they bump into another gas or against the wall, they create a pressure. Let's take a look and see what happens when you go in and decrease the volume. They are going to run into the wall more often. They're going to run into each other more often. So yeah, that is going to go in and increase pressure. But then again, the opposite occurs. If you go in and open that cylinder back up, you're increasing the volume and decreasing the pressure. So this whole Boyle's law is really, really important to make sure that we know that when we change the volume of the thoracic cavity, that's going to change the pressure in the thoracic cavity. That's the key. And the reason why we need to change the pressure is because we need a pressure gradient. So pressure gradients are going to exist whenever you have a pressure in one area that is going to be greater compared to the pressure in another area. So usually it's going to be because of the gradient exists between two interconnected regions. So let's take a look at this picture here. This is going to be where you have two volumes that are going to, or two areas, and they are going to be equal volume. Look, there's no net movement. If this one moves out, then this one's going to move in there. So really no net movement that is going in and occurring. So pressure A is going to equal pressure B because they're going to have equal areas, right? Let's take a look and see what happens when we change the volume and how that's going to change pressure. So look at this. So here's volume B. Look at what we did. We went in and increased volume B. Remember Boyle's law, anytime that you increase volume, you decrease pressure. Look, these gases over here are jealous. They're like, you have so much room in there. We are trapped in this tiny little space. We want to come in and be in this more roomy area. So they move from a high pressure to a low pressure. That's exactly what's happening here. They're going to do that until pressure becomes equal. Let's go in and squeeze that volume B smaller. So look, we went in and decreased the volume, and that increased pressure. So these gases in here are like, no, 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 it is too crowded in here. Too crowded. It's too small. There's too many of us. Let's go to where there's a little bit more room and there's less pressure, right? So it goes from a high pressure to a lower pressure. So that is what a pressure gradient is. That's what is happening. And that's how Boyle's law and what it is going to, or what it's going to have to do with pressure gradients. All right, so now that we know that, let's take a look at our final thing before we can actually talk about what happens during breathing. Let's look at these different volumes and pressures that are associated with breathing. So you do have atmospheric pressure. So if I were to draw my little, this is going to be my thoracic cavity. It's sad, right? Anytime once we start getting into the mechanics of breathing and I draw this thing, just think, oh, that's Miss Watson's thoracic cavity. That's pretty bad. So everything outside of our body, so you have this atmosphere, right? Everybody knows about what an atmosphere is. The atmosphere is going to be the air in the environment around us, and it is going to be filled with gases. Yeah. So what you have is atmospheric pressure, and that's going to be the pressure or the weight of the gases in the air and how they are exerted on the environment. So this usually stays constant because not a whole lot of us travel all the time, or not. I'm going to say, I know there's people that like to travel. I travel too, but there's not a whole lot of people that travel to different altitudes a lot. Maybe you do because you travel to Colorado for your work or something, but in general, there's most people that is going to stay the same. Really, the only time that it changes if we do change altitude. Let's think about what happens with altitude. When we increase altitude, as we kind of go up into like the mountains or something like that, the air becomes thinner. That means that you don't have as many gases in that air. That's what it means by thinner. So that is going to go in and decrease the weight that's in the air or the pressure. So that's actually going to lower the atmospheric pressure. We'll get all into that when we talk about changes in altitude and things like that. But for the most part, atmospheric pressure is going to stay the same. It's going to be unchanged at 760 millimeters of mercury. That's also equal to 1 atm. So you might have seen it put that way. But we are going to use here in our anatomy and physiology class 760 millimeters of mercury. All right, so that's going to be the atmosphere outside. I'm not going to draw the whole entire body, but you guys get the picture. So that's going to be, and anytime that when we get to actually the mechanics of breathing, I'm going to write atmospheric pressure like this. P with an ATM, atmospheric pressure equals 760. And just remember, it's millimeters of mercury. I just don't want to write that all out. All right, now we have one on the outside of our body. Let's take a look at the pressure on the inside here in the thoracic wall or the thoracic cavity. So you do have collectively all of the volume that's inside of the alveoli is called alveolar volume. And remember, the alveoli are inside of the lungs. So that's why this thing called intrapulmonary pressure is going to be associated with alveolar volume. So basically, intrapulmonary pressure is going to be that pressure inside of the lungs here. And that is going to fluctuate with breathing. So I can't write what it is right now because it's going to change whenever we inhale. It's going to change when we exhale. It's going to be equal to atmospheric pressure in between inhalation and exhalation. So anytime that I write that out, it is going to be PUL. And it's going to be intrapulmonary pressure. So just make sure you note that a lot of books will use intraalveolar pressure and use those interchangeably, which is fine, because if you think about it, since these are going to be associated, since the alveoli is going to be found in the lungs, then a lot of books will only focus on that intraalveolar pressure. that should be, oh, that looks bad. I'll make sure that I put a little thing over that so you'll know exactly how to write it, because that is not good at all. Can't even read that. So just make sure you note that there's a lot of books, websites that will use intraalveolar pressure instead of intrapulmonary pressure, which is fine. Just we're going to use intrapulmonary pressure because that's what our book uses. Yeah. Let's take a look at other ones. You guys remember this, intrapleural pressure. That is going to fluctuate with breathing, but remember that it always needs to be lower than that intrapulmonary pressure to help make sure that the lungs stay inflated. And again, it's usually about 4 millimeters of mercury, should be mercury in there, 4 millimeters of mercury lower than intrapulmonary pressure. So roughly 756, really just depends on what happens with inhalation and exhalation. We're not going to focus on this and what happens to this as we go through the mechanics of breathing. It's just an extra pressure that I don't want to throw in at this point. So the book does talk about it, goes in and talks about how that is going to change. So if you're interested in it, make sure you read about it. But I want to focus on the two main pressures, which is atmospheric and that intrapulmonary pressure. All right, so we're going to talk about how the volume change in the thoracic cavity is going to cause changes in mainly this pressure in here, right? Yeah, because since this is my thoracic cavity and this is where the volume is changing, really this is the only one that we're going to focus on that's going to change, and it's going to cause a pressure gradient. And that's going to be the driving force between inhalation and exhalation. Let's do this. All right. So the first thing that you need, so again, I want to mention about the book and how it goes in and talks about, hey, these muscles are contracting, and when they contract, they are going to cause this vertical change, and these muscles are going to cause this anterior posterior change. Remember, don't worry about that. What I really want you guys to know are what muscles are responsible for each inhalation, exhalation, forced as well. But just in general, what's going on with the thoracic cavity? Is the volume increasing or is the volume decreasing? Again, I will talk specifically about what's happening with the diaphragm just because of how I'm drawing it. But other than that, we really want to focus on just in general, increasing volume, decreasing volume. Again, don't worry about intrapleural pressure. If you're interested in it, the book talks about it. So read all about it. All right. The first thing we need to worry about, or we need to know about, is at this point, intrapulmonary pressure is going to equal atmospheric pressure at 760 millimeters of mercury. That's where we're going to start. So let's go ahead and draw our thoracic cavity, kinda. Remember, this is my generalized thoracic cavity. And look, I have my diaphragm right here. The way that it starts out is the diaphragm is going to be domed like this. And that's one of the main volume changes that we're going to be taking a look at. All right. So later on, we're going to talk about how the diaphragm and the external intercostals are going to get a signal from the nervous system to contract. They have to, right? They can't contract unless they get a signal from the nervous system. All right. So when the diaphragm and the external intercostals contract, look at what's going to happen. It's going to change from looking like this. The diaphragm is going to flatten out. And remember, those external intercostals are going to go in and open the rib cage the other way. It's going to open it, anterior, posterior, all of those other ones that it talks about. It's going to make it wider, and it's going to make it longer. So I just can't show it on my nice little picture here. But that's what the external intercostals are going to do. Most of the volume change is going to come from that diaphragm. 2/3 of the volume change comes from this diaphragm. So see how it goes from this to flatten? We opened up the volume, didn't we? So what you have is the muscles contract. So that is step one, muscles contracting. Volume is going to increase. The volume of the thoracic cavity is going to increase. So remember Boyle's law, when volume increases, that is going to cause a change in pressure. Pressure is going to decrease. Do you guys remember what intrapulmonary pressure is right now? Intrapulmonary pressure is 760 at this point. So it is going to decrease. It doesn't decrease much, but it's enough. It decreases to 759. So let's talk about how what the other pressure is on the outside. This is the inside pressure right here. Let's talk about what's on the outside. Remember, atmospheric pressure, 760. So what happens is you just have a pressure gradient. You just made a pressure gradient. Remember that it wants to flow from a high pressure to a low pressure. So it is wanting to go from the atmosphere into the thoracic cavity. Look, you just inhaled because of everything that just happened there. That's going to happen until these are going to equal again. Doesn't take much, right? It's only 1 millimeter of mercury, but it's enough to have that nice quiet inhalation. You know, it's very subtle whenever you do it. Sometimes you don't even realize that you're going in and breathing in because of that. So the air that you just breathed in, it's not a whole lot. It's only 500 milliliters. So, I mean, if you think about it, yeah, I guess it is. It is a lot, but not as much as you would think with quiet breathing. That's called tidal volume. Tidal volume is going to be the amount of air that you take in with just a normal inhalation or exhalation. So that's really basically it in inspiration. So let's take a look and see what happens when we want to quietly breathe out. Remember, quiet breathing, eupnea, is at rest. All right. So remember last time I talked about how the pressure gradient is going to flow from 760 out from the atmosphere in to that 759 until pressure has equalized. All right, so now we are back to equal pressure. That's what we have. We are starting back at 760. So right now, this is what our thoracic cavity looks like. It is going to be wider. You can't see what it looks like the other directions. It's going to be vertically bigger as well because that diaphragm is flattened. So just through natural relaxation, it is going to, the diaphragm is going to go back to that dome shape. And then the external intercostals are going to relax, and it's not going to be as wide or as deep either. So look what you just did to the volume. You decreased the volume. No muscles contract. They only relax. And another thing that is going to happen is you are going to have that elastic connective tissue in the lungs recoil as well. That's going to pull those lungs in, and it's going to cause a smaller volume in there as well. So you have a decrease in volume that just occurred because of relaxation of those muscles, and it also occurred because of the recoil of the elastic tissue. All right, Boyle's law, when volume changes, when volume decreases, you have an increase in pressure. So we went from 760 to 761 on the inside. Looks like gravestones, doesn't it? So again, let's take a look at our gradient. Remember, atmospheric pressure is always 760. So air wants to go from a high pressure to a low pressure, which is on the outside. That is exhalation because of that pressure gradient that you just created because of a volume change. So it goes from the thoracic cavity and is going to go out of all of those little structures of the respiratory system to the atmosphere. And that's what's going to happen there. So this whole process of quiet exhalation is known as a passive process. The reason why is because no muscles contract. Now, inspiration is always going to be an active process because muscles are contracting with forced and with quiet breathing. But quiet breathing only, with quiet exhalation only, it's known as a passive process because we don't have to contract any muscles whatsoever. They just naturally relax. So this is just a little chart that's showing the changes that occur in quiet breathing. Let's take a look at forced breathing. So really the same thing is going to occur. You are going to have a stimulus from the nervous system, and they are going to go in and cause contraction of muscles. The diaphragm is still going to contract for inhalation. The external intercostals are still going to contract for inhalation, but you're actually going to go in and recruit more muscles. Look, remember, these are the muscles you're going to go in and recruit. What they are doing is they are just going in and causing a greater change in that thoracic cavity volume. If you can go in and get a greater change in the volume, you can actually get a greater pressure difference as well. So because you have a greater pressure gradient, that's going to allow you to take in so much more air with forced inhalation. So just if you just breathe in forcefully, you can actually feel those muscles contracting and going in, and you can feel how much the volume of your thoracic cavity is pulling upward and pulling outward, and that's going to create this bigger volume change, which creates a bigger pressure change and just a bigger pressure gradient. So that's how you can take in more. Let's take a look at what happens with forced expiration. Again, it goes to where it's not going to be passive anymore with this. We actually have to get some muscles involved. So take a deep breath in. And now I want you to forcefully exhale all of the breath out as you can and feel the muscles that are involved. I bet you felt a lot of your ab muscles contracting, right? What the ab muscles are doing is they are going in and pushing up and pushing that diaphragm into an even bigger dome to cause a smaller volume in that thoracic cavity. But also what you're doing is you're going in and pushing downward and pushing inward too. You're trying to get the smallest volume possible in your thoracic cavity, so you can go in and create a bigger pressure difference so you can force out as much air as possible. So that is basically it for the mechanics of breathing. You did not think that inhalation and exhalation was that involved, did you? So what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to take a look at the whole nervous system and its role in breathing, and also just take a look at a few of those respiratory volumes and capacities. But again, you'll look at that more in lab. Until next time.